At Designer Shoe Warehouse, we believe that shoes are an important part of, well, everything.
From first steps to first dates, from all-nighters to all-time personal bests.
From building pillow forts to building a life.
For all the big and small moments that make up your whole world, DSW is there. And we've got just the shoes. Find a shoe for every you from brands you love at brag-worthy prices at your DSW store or DSW.com.
This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X Business Card has no preset spending limit, so the card's purchasing power can adapt to meet business needs. Plus, the card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase, so the more a business spends, the more miles earned. And when traveling, the Venture X Business Card grants access to over 1,000 airport lounges. The Venture X Business Card. What's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
Hey everyone, Sebastian here. You are about to listen to the third and final installment in our series on Mata Hari. Today's show is going to be featuring discussions about sex and sexuality. So if you are not interested in hearing that kind of a show, or if you are listening with younger people, you may want to sit this one out. For everyone else, enjoy the show. Do you ever wonder what the first line of your obituary will be? After you've passed on and someone else has to look at your life and determine exactly what defined you, what will pop out? Your family life, your career, athletic achievements, mountains climbed? Perhaps you had a brush with fame or notoriety along the way. One of my favorite songwriters working right now is the great Jason Isbell, and he has a lyric in one of his songs that goes, "Are you living the life you chose, or are you living the life that chose you?" It's a simple little idea. It's kind of a quaint lyric, actually. But what I like about it is that in the context of the song, Isbell doesn't seem to be passing judgment on either path. At least that's not how I interpret it. I think he's just posing a question about how much agency we truly have when it comes to the course of our lives. Are we merely navigating a chaotic universe? Or, through focused intention, can we manifest a specific vision for our lives? Or can we kind of manifest some things while also surfing some chaos? I think about this all the time. Will the person who has to write your obituary write about the life you chose or the life that chose you? When the former head of French intelligence, Georges Ladoux, passed away in 1933, news of his death was carried in papers all around the world. Without fail, the headline placed over his obituary always featured the name Mata Hari. The New York Times reported, quote, "Georges Ladoux, dead in France, as chief of nation's Cognier Espionage Bureau, caused Mata Hari's execution," end quote. Even the relatively small California newspaper, the San Pedro News Pilot, reported in 1933, quote, "Ladoux, captor of Mata Hari, dies," end quote. Georges Ladoux only knew Margarita Zella, better known as the dancer Mata Hari, for around 1 year. But that 1 year would come to define the rest of his life. No matter what else happened in the course of Georges Ladoux's existence, he was to be remembered first and foremost as the captor of Mata Hari. This is understandable considering that Mata Hari's trial and execution were international news in 1917. The idea that one of Europe's most provocative entertainers had been secretly working as a spy was just too juicy a story to ignore. Just think about the media frenzy that any celebrity trial has created in our own lifetimes. While we certainly did not have the same media culture during the First World War that we have now, a celebrity, even a faded celebrity, being executed for espionage was noteworthy, to say the least. For his part, Ledoux seems to have understood just how significant his involvement in the Mata Hari case would be for his legacy. To this end, Ledoux did his best to curate how he would be remembered through his autobiography. Ledoux's book has become one of the key sources for a number of particularly dramatic moments in Mata Hari's life, as he spent quite a lot of time detailing meetings he had with the dancer behind closed doors. One of the most pivotal meetings between Ledoux and Mata Hari occurred on September 18th, 1916. Mata Hari had just returned to Paris from the spa town of Vittel. Her lover, the Russian military officer Vladimir Maslov, had just proposed. She wanted to marry him, but she needed money. Now, according to Mata Hari, Georges Ledoux had floated the idea of her spying for the French at their first meeting before she left for Vittel. So, on September 18th, she returned to his office to take him up on that offer. Ledoux would claim that he never offered to make her a spy at their first meeting. He would insist it was Mata Hari who first proposed the idea of working for Le Deuxième Bureau, France's spy agency. According to Ledoux, Mata Hari marched into his office that day and offered her services as a secret agent for the mind-boggling fee of 1 million francs. In Ledoux's account, he claimed that he used this opportunity to deceive and entrap Mata Hari. Without saying anything overly committal, he led her to believe that he accepted her offer. She was convinced after this meeting that she was a French spy. But of course, Ledoux's account is not entirely trustworthy. He had a vested interest in presenting Mata Hari as someone who was eager to penetrate the French intelligence service. He would later argue at trial that Le Deuxième Bureau never truly employed her. According to Ledoux, he was always constructing an elaborate trap in which to ensnare a woman he believed to be a German agent. In his autobiography, Ledoux's recreation of this conversation with Mata Hari would read like a script for a slightly overwrought spy movie. Ledoux claims that after hearing Mata Hari's offer to spy for 1 million francs, he said, quote, "Listen, I am certain, absolutely certain, you are an agent in the service of Germany. But I will overlook this at the moment because you have come to me to make this proposition, which will put you in such a situation, if I accept, that you will proceed to betray Germany or us. You are a gambler, Mata Hari, and you must play. Rouge et noir. Red, it is us. Over the line that you see there, that of the front, where the blood flows night and day for 2 years already. Black, it is your German friends. I warn you, red wins, black loses. Reflect well before placing your bet. Tomorrow it will be too late. I will leave you this night to think it over." End quote. This is wonderful. But does anyone really talk like that? I know the French have a reputation for a certain poetry in their phrasing, but my God, this sounds like a bad imitation of a Tarantino script. You are a gambler, Mata Hari. You must play. Come on, man. Now, I suppose I'm extra skeptical of Ledoux's version of events because I know what happened next. A few months after the execution of Mata Hari, Ledoux himself would be arrested for espionage and accused of spying for the Germans. You heard that right. The man who was instrumental in Mata Hari's execution was himself accused of being a German spy. Ledoux was eventually exonerated of this charge after being formally acquitted at trial, but he lost his job as the head of Le Deuxième Bureau and spent the rest of his career pushing paper in the Army Records Department. One of the great mysteries still surrounding this story has to do with Ladoux. The records associated with his arrest and trial remain sealed to this very day. Was Ladoux simply a victim of the quote-unquote spy mania that was sweeping through France near the end of the Great War? Or was there something to these accusations? This has led some to speculate that Ladoux's entire gambit with Mata Hari may have been an elaborate smokescreen meant to draw attention away from his own dealings with the Germans. Of course, this has never been proven and will remain nothing but pure speculation until the pertinent records are unsealed by the French government. Still, even the accusation of traitorous activity can tarnish what might otherwise be a heroic reputation. I think Ladoux sensed that the headline of his obituary might read, "Ladoux, spy chief accused of betraying France," when it could read, "Ladoux, captor of Mata Hari." And that second headline sounded infinitely better. So he used his autobiography to curate his legacy. He presented his dealings with Mata Hari in a very specific way. He even gave himself some pretty good lines that could easily find their way into the inevitable film adaptation. "Rouge et noir, red or black. You are a gambler, Mata Hari. You must play." In Ladoux's account, Mata Hari responded to all of this by saying, quote, "I have thought it over. I will play red. I am a gambler, but I am superstitious also, and I am sure in coming to you that it will bring me happiness." End quote. So began Mata Hari's final act. Whether or not her status was officially recognized by Le Deuxième Bureau, Mata Hari believed she was a spy in the service of France. Did that make her a double agent? Well, that depends on whether or not you trust Mata Hari. She would insist to her dying day that while she took money from the Germans, she never did any real work for them. There is no doubt that Mata Hari was playing a dangerous game, but did she deserve her ultimate fate in front of a French firing squad? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 175, Who Framed Mata Hari, Part 3. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone listening that if you would like to hear this podcast ad-free, you can always go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and start supporting at $5 or more every month. At that level of support, you will get access to an ad-free feed and all the other extra content I have on offer. If you're digging Our Fake History and you want to hear those extra shows, then you got to go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. All right. This week, we are wrapping up our trilogy on Mata Hari, the exotic dancer executed as a German spy during the First World War. As you have hopefully already pieced together, this is part 3 of a 3-part series. So if you have not heard the first 2 parts, I strongly suggest that you go back and give those a listen now. Things get pretty twisty in this one, so if you don't have any background, you'll be lost. So honestly, this is one where you really gotta go back and get the context. In part 1 of this series, I introduced you to Margarethe Zelle, the young woman born in the Netherlands who, after a fairly traumatic adolescence, married an officer in the Dutch colonial army and was whisked off to Indonesia, which at the time was still part of the Dutch colonial empire. There, more tragedy followed as she lost her first child, likely to congenital syphilis passed on by her infected husband. From there, we traced her return to Europe, where she separated from her husband and created a new life in Paris. There, she dabbled in sex work and circus riding before reinventing herself as the exotic dancer Mata Hari. Taking elements of Javanese dance that she had observed in Indonesia and combining them with well-known Orientalist stereotypes, Mata Hari crafted a performance that she claimed was an authentic Hindu temple dance. The dances were made all the more enticing by the fact that she removed her clothes and was nearly nude by the end of the presentation. As you heard, Mata Hari's performances very quickly caught the attention of European theatergoers. While her titillating dances had much in common with the stripteases performed in burlesque cabarets and brothels, they were given an air of respectability by Mata Hari's insistence that they were in fact sincere religious rites. Between 1905 and 1908, Mata Hari became one of Europe's most in-demand performers and comfortably toured large theaters around the continent. In part 2 of this series, we saw how Mata Hari's star began to fade as tastes changed in Europe. By 1914 and the outbreak of the First World War, she was booking fewer and fewer performances. It was around that time that she started to sustain her celebrity lifestyle through a combination of unambiguous sex work and more ambiguous relationships with wealthy men. When war was declared in 1914, Mata Hari found herself in Berlin. In her haste to get out of Germany, many of her valuables, including cash, some furs, and jewels, were seized by the German officials. This would be significant because just over a year later, while living in The Hague, she was approached by a German consul to the Netherlands named Karl Kromer. Kromer offered her 20,000 francs to return to her old home of Paris and start spying for the Germans. Mata Hari took the money, but would later insist that she never did any real spying for the German Empire. Instead, she insisted that she deceived Kromer and took the money as recompense for the valuables that had been seized in Germany in 1914. This is an important point, so keep it in mind. Despite her insistence that she never did any work for the Germans, Mata Hari chose to leave the Netherlands and returned to Paris not long after taking money from the German consul. On her trip, she was immediately identified by the British as a suspicious person. These suspicions were shared with French intelligence, and by the time Mata Hari arrived in Paris in 1916, she was being watched closely by agents working for both Allied intelligence services. When we left off, Mata Hari had made the somewhat dangerous decision to visit her Russian lover, Vladimir Maslov, in the French spa town of Vittel. Vittel was technically in the French military zone and required a special passport in order to visit. To get the passport, Mata Hari had to take a meeting with Georges Ladoux, the head of Le Deuxième Bureau, France's intelligence service. At that meeting, Ladoux may or may not have floated the idea that Mata Hari could use her talents to spy for France. As we heard in the introduction, when Mata Hari returned from Vittel, she hoped that she could make a quick fortune spying for Ledoux and then use the money to start her new life as the wife of the Russian officer Vladimir Maslov. Mata Hari would insist that when she became a French spy, she was only accepting an offer made by Ledoux, who had already made it clear that he knew about her past with the Germans. She would later argue that she felt like she was officially declaring for the French at that moment. She believed that Le Deuxième Bureau understood that while she had had some dealings with the Germans, she was never properly one of their spies. She thought that her loyalty to France was obvious. Why else would Ledoux offer her a job in the first place? This brings us up to date. Now, when reading the sources, it's hard to tell if Mata Hari was really as naive as she sometimes comes off. Before the war, she showed absolutely no interest in politics. So it doesn't seem like she had any real ideological reasons for supporting either the Germans or the French. Personally, I trust that her sympathies leaned towards the French for no other reason than the fact that she liked living in Paris. She was not a stupid woman, and yet she was so cavalier in her dealings with Le Deuxième Bureau, it seems at times like she really did not understand just how dangerous her situation had become. Or maybe she did. Maybe she perfectly understood just how desperate her situation was and wagered that the only way to avoid being collared as a German spy was to be an even better French spy. Sadly, for Mata Hari, she was not a good spy, period. So let's pick up with Marguerite Zella in the fall of 1916 and see how her short career as a French secret agent played out. As much as Georges Ledoux would later claim that he never truly recruited Mata Hari as a spy in September of 1916, it is clear that he gave her a mission. Mata Hari was going to be used as a good old-fashioned honey trap. This is the age-old tactic where a beautiful spy seduces a person with important information and then teases the goods out of them over pillow talk. Mata Hari's mission was to head to German-occupied Belgium by way of the Netherlands. Once there, she was to use her connections amongst high society folk to get introduced to the German General Moritz Ferdinand Freiherr von Bissing. Von Bissing was no less than the Governor-General of occupied Belgium. If she could, she was to seduce von Bissing and then use her proximity to the general to discover as many German military secrets as possible, which she would then dutifully pass along to the French. This is the kind of seductive spy work that has formed much of the Mata Hari myth. The pop culture image of Mata Hari would have us believe that she was a master of these kinds of operations. She's been remembered, even celebrated, as the ultimate honeypot. But in reality, She was incredibly unsuccessful in her attempts to use the art of seduction to procure sensitive information. She never even came close to trapping a German general in a sexy snare. She never even made it to Belgium. The plan was for Mata Hari to start this mission by first traveling to The Hague, establishing herself in the neutral Netherlands, and then moving, hopefully less conspicuously, to Belgium. The first step was for her to take a train to neutral Spain and then hop on a steamer to the Netherlands in the port city of Vigo. Why the roundabout travel route? Well, remember, there was a giant war going on, so moving directly from France to anywhere was tricky, especially if you were trying to keep a low profile. But Mata Hari never seemed to be able to keep a low profile. While traveling on the steamer, the SS Hollandia, en route to the Netherlands, she was once again detained and questioned by the British when the steamer docked at the English port of Falmouth. However, on this particular occasion, it may not have been her fault. The British had received information that a German secret agent who had been operating in Spain by the name of Clara Benedicts was on the Hollandia. Clara Benedicts was a real German spy at this time, who worked as a flamenco dancer in Spain. Not only was she a dancer like Mata Hari, she also roughly fit Mata Hari's description. Further, the two women had met. Mata Hari and Clara Benedicts had once shared a train compartment together. So, when the British intelligence service, now known as MI5, searched the steamer and found Mata Hari, they had her detained on suspicion that she was actually Clara Benedicts. Following this so far? She wasn't just questioned at the port either. Mata Hari was transported to London, where she was formally questioned at Scotland Yard. There, she endured hours of questions about whether or not she was in fact Clara Benedicts, or if she had ever met Clara Benedicts. Now, I know this seems like a bit of a confusing interlude in Mata Hari's story, but this incident perhaps sheds some light on why the Germans tried to recruit Mata Hari in the first place. Now, this is just a theory, but folks like biographer Mary Craig have suggested that it's possible that Mata Hari was always meant to act as a distraction. The Germans never wanted her to do any real spying. She was way too conspicuous for that. Also, she couldn't be trusted with any real German secrets. All they needed to do was conspicuously send her some money in a way that the foreign intelligence services would clearly notice. The theory goes that the Germans wanted the Allies to think that Mata Hari was a spy, because then, as she bumbled across international borders, this famous woman would suck up the time and the attention of Allied spy catchers, while real agents could go about their work in secret. It also didn't hurt that Mata Hari roughly fit the description of the real German secret agent Clara Benedicts. Mata Hari was the more famous, more attention-grabbing version of Clara Benedicts. If one of them was going to get nabbed, it would probably be Mata Hari. So it's possible that German intelligence planted the information that Clara Benedicts was going to be on Mata Hari's steamer, the SS Hollandia. Specifically so, the British would apprehend Mata Hari and confuse her with the real Benedicts. The added confusion would hopefully add some more cover to Clara Benedict's real movements. Now, beyond the information I've already told you, there is no other hard evidence to support this theory. It's just a guess. But to be honest, I am personally persuaded by this theory. The Germans didn't need Mata Hari to be a real spy. They just needed her to take the money. And Mata Hari could always be relied on to take the money. Anyway, while in British custody, Mata Hari did everything she could think of to be released. She even spilled the beans that she was a spy for the French. She asked her interrogator to send a telegram to Georges Ladoux to have the whole confusion cleared up. Now, it's not so crazy to tell an agent from an allied power that you've been recruited by the French intelligence service, but it fits a pattern of, let's call it, sloppy spy work. From what we can tell, Ladoux never once acknowledged that Mata Hari was his agent to the British. After 4 days, MI5 were finally satisfied that Mata Hari was not in fact Clara Benedict's. They had discovered that she was Margarita Zella, who was on their watch list as a suspected spy. You might remember that around a year earlier, the British authorities had sent a message to the French letting them know that if Margarita Zella ever came back to the UK, they would have her arrested. This time, though, the British allowed her to leave, but they forbade her from returning to the Netherlands. Traveling to German-occupied Belgium was now totally out. Her only choice was to head back to Spain. So she caught another steamer and headed back to the port of Vigo. Once she had arrived, she then headed to Madrid, where she set herself up in a fine hotel and awaited instruction from Ladoux. But new instructions never came. Ladoux had fallen frustratingly silent. Now, if you are building the case that Mata Hari was an objectively terrible spy, you would point out that she was incredibly indiscreet about her communication. She sent letters with sensitive information written in regular ink through the regular post all the time. Spies are not supposed to do this. These letters could easily be intercepted and often were. Even before she left France on her mission, Ladoux warned her about communicating in this way. Ladoux would record in his autobiography that he told Mata Hari that if she wasn't going to communicate using encrypted channels, then she should at least use the special invisible ink provided by the intelligence service. But Mata Hari didn't like using invisible ink, so she never did. So, Mata Hari was either doing this because she was playing three-dimensional chess and she wanted the Germans to read all of her correspondence with Ladoux, or she was just that sloppy. I'm inclined to believe the latter, but you can make up your own mind. Anyway, after not getting word from Ladoux for many days in Madrid, Mata Hari made yet another dangerous decision. If she couldn't run a honey trap in Belgium, well, maybe she could run one right here in Madrid. So Mata Hari sought out a German official who she thought might possess some information worth stealing. The man she identified was Captain Arnold Kahle, a career military man and an attaché at the German embassy in Madrid. Now, her choice of Kahle was interesting, as he was the head of German intelligence in Spain. He was the man to whom all German spies in the country reported to. Getting close to Kahle was dangerous. Now, if Mata Hari truly was working for the Germans, then it's possible that she got close to Kahle because he was her handler, her German contact in Spain. Now, she would later insist that this was not true and that she had set her sights on Kala because she figured he had access to sensitive information. Again, it all depends on whether or not you believe Mata Hari. What we know for sure is Mata Hari first met with Kala on December 23rd, 1916, under the pretense that she, Mata Hari, the world-famous dancer, wanted an explanation for the Clara Benedict's debacle. At this meeting, Kala allegedly let 2 pieces of sensitive information drop that Mata Hari then passed on to Le Deuxième Bureau. First, he mentioned that he reported to one Baron Roland, an even more senior German spy master. Secondly, Kala also casually mentioned that he was preoccupied with a German submarine that was currently on a mission to drop off some Turkish and German officers in French Morocco. So, what should we make of this? Why would Captain Kala so carelessly discuss sensitive information at his first meeting with Mata Hari? Well, it could mean that Kala genuinely thought that Mata Hari was a German agent who could be trusted. Or, if Mata Hari was secretly loyal to the Germans, this ultimately vague and useless information may have been purposefully leaked so she could appear loyal to the French without truly harming the German war effort. Or, and personally I think this is the case, Kala fed Mata Hari some important sounding, but ultimately vague and worthless information, specifically to suss out if Mata Hari could be trusted. It turns out she could not be trusted. While Mata Hari was still being ignored by Ledoux, she determined that she needed to have another French contact in Madrid to whom she could report. She would later claim that her thinking was that she would need proof that she'd really done some spying, so Ledoux would hopefully pay her. To this end, she developed a relationship with a senior attaché at the French embassy, one Colonel Joseph Devigné. While in Madrid, she started making regular reports to Devigné about her dealings with the German Captain Kala. Again, often writing him easily intercepted, uncoded letters. Okay, I know I'm hitting you with a lot of names, so are we following this so far? Remember, our German spy master in Spain, Captain Kala. Our French contact at the embassy in Madrid, Joseph Devigné. I think you got it. Over the course of a month in Madrid, Mata Hari got closer and closer to Kala until they eventually struck up a sexual relationship. As a result, Mata Hari was able to get other small bits of information out of Kala that she then passed on to Devigné. For instance, Kala mentioned that the Germans had cracked a French radio code. He also let it slip, or maybe intentionally dropped, that the Germans knew that a French pilot had managed to drop some agents behind German lines. Then, at one of their final meetings, Kala and Mata Hari had sex, and Kala gave Mata Hari 3,500 pesetas, pesetas being the Spanish currency at the time. This money would come back to haunt Mata Hari. Now, it's a little unclear what this money was for. Was this money payment for sex? It is quite possible. But Mata Hari's French accusers would later claim at trial that this payment was for her continued services as a German spy. Now, everything I just described encapsulates Mata Hari's entire spying career, more or less. She tried to run a honeypot in Belgium, but she was busted by the British before she even got there. Then she tried to put together an ad hoc honeypot scheme in Madrid. and got a couple of fairly useless nuggets of intel out of Captain Kala. And there's a high probability that Kala knew exactly what Mata Hari's game was, and he played her more than she played him. Now, while all this was going on in Madrid, Le Deuxième Bureau back in Paris intercepted some very interesting wireless messages being sent on an encrypted German channel that the French had managed to decode. The messages were from Captain Kala in Madrid to his intelligence counterparts in Berlin. And by the way, the French intelligence team that did radio interceptions were stationed in the Eiffel Tower. And I honestly can't get over this detail. I had not learned about this before. This is like the French equivalent of Team America World Police having their headquarters inside of Mount Rushmore. It's like if you found out that James Bond had an apartment behind the clock face of Big Ben. But it turns out this was totally real. So that's awesome. Anyway, starting in early December, the team in the Eiffel Tower started intercepting messages sent between Berlin and Madrid concerning a German agent codenamed H21. The first of these messages was that H21 had made contact with Captain Kala in Madrid. On December 25th, a second message was intercepted that instructed Captain Kala to pay H21 3,000 francs. A message sent the next day from Madrid to Berlin reported that H21 had been paid 3,500 pesetas and that further payments should be made to H21's staff in Roermond, Netherlands. This message was the nail in the coffin for Mata Hari. It was with this message that the French were able to make a very strong case that German agent H21 was Margarita Zella. You see, as soon as Mata Hari got enough money, she hired for herself a personal maid. Now, no matter what her fortunes were over the years, she always kept this maid on the payroll. When Mata Hari embarked on her adventures as a spy, she had let her maid return to her hometown of Roermond in the Netherlands. The fact that this message contained the exact amount of money passed from Kala to Mata Hari and specifically referenced a servant in Roermond made it quite clear that H21 had to be Mata Hari. Or, at least, the Germans wanted the French to believe that Mata Hari was H21. Because here's the wrinkle to this whole thing. And I know, it gets confusing, but here's the thing. These messages were sent in a code that the French had broken, and it seems like the Germans knew that the code was broken. The Germans had generally stopped using this code by that point in the war. Apparently, a low-level staffer at the Eiffel Tower eventually found this curious and made a report about it to his superiors. That's how we know about this now. Why were the Germans sending these messages using a broken code? Was this deliberate misinformation? Were they sending these messages in a way that was guaranteed to be intercepted and decoded by the French? Were the Germans purposefully trying to incriminate Mata Hari? It's a possibility that I think is worth considering. Now, I'm sure you're asking, to what end? Why set up Mata Hari? What is there to gain? The answer is cover for real spies. After the bloodbath at the Battle of Verdun, French society had become especially paranoid. Spies were suspected to be everywhere, and as such, French spy hunting had been picked up with a new fervor. The Germans knew that the French were eager to catch a high-profile spy. So why not deliver them Mata Hari on a platter? She had probably never even done any real spying for them anyway. She wasn't even a legitimate asset. So why not use her as a pawn who could be cultivated so she could be sacrificed? At least, so goes the theory. The other damning telegraph intercepted by the French was one that detailed the exact information passed from H-21 to Captain Kala. The telegram reported that H-21 had heard some well-known gossip about a princess of Greece having an affair with the French prime minister, in hopes that the French might help her husband, the prince, secure the Greek throne. Now, this sounds very scandalous, but this was hardly a state secret. Apparently, this was the talk of high society parties in Paris, Madrid, and other European capitals. The telegram also stated that H-21 had heard that, quote, Britain has political and military control over France. French are afraid to speak up. General offensive planned for next spring, end quote. Now, once again, as far as military secrets go, this information is pretty lame. The idea that Britain was pulling the strings of their French ally was a fairly widely held opinion. It's the kind of thing you could read in a newspaper in any neutral country at the time. As for the general offensive planned in the spring, well, this was hardly a piece of secret information. General offensives were usually planned for the spring. At least they had been in the past few years of the war. Now, if Mata Hari actually said these things to the Germans, then she gave them absolutely no useful intelligence. All of this stuff was either fairly well-known gossip or pedestrian opinions about the shape of the war. My point is that this is not the kind of information that gets soldiers killed on the front lines. You'll sometimes read that Mata Hari passed on information concerning the new tanks that the Allies were about to deploy on the Western Front. This is nonsense. There is absolutely no evidence to support that claim. Once these intercepted telegrams were decoded and passed along to Georges Ladoux, the game had ended for Mata Hari. After her short adventure in Madrid, Mata Hari returned to Paris in early January 1917. When she arrived, she found that she was having a hard time accessing money and making contact with old friends. What was worse is she could still not get the attention of Georges Ladoux. After days of agitation, Ladoux finally agreed to see Mata Hari on January 5th. The meeting was tense. Mata Hari made the case that she deserved to be compensated for the work that she'd done in Spain. Ladoux coldly brushed her off. He told her that the information that she had procured was useless. He then dismissed her, and the two would not see each other again until Mata Hari's trial. A few weeks later, on February 13th, a group of French police officers entered Mata Hari's room at the Palais Élysée Hotel. They had with them a warrant for her arrest, accusing her of, quote, espionage, attempted espionage, complicity in espionage, and intelligence with the enemy, end quote. She was taken first to the Palace of Justice and then on to Saint-Lazare prison, where she would live until her trial. Mata Hari's career as a spy had officially ended. So, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll look at the final chapter in the life of Mata Hari. I think if we are being honest about Mata Hari's activities during the First World War, especially given recent historical research, I don't think we can say that she was completely innocent. Even if we accept her version of events, then she honestly thought that she could take German money and act as a French spy, and this somehow wouldn't be a problem. As I've mentioned before on this podcast, if I have a bias, it would be a certain level of sympathy for Margarita Zella. But there are so many times in this story where she makes choices that make even the most sympathetic observer shake their head and go, "What were you thinking?" But with that said, I think we can also recognize that Mata Hari did not get a fair trial. First, there was the issue of her interrogation. This was carried out by Captain Pierre Bouchardon, the investigating magistrate of France's Third Council of War. The interrogator's job was to get information out of the prisoner that would then be later used by the prosecutors at trial. Now, Bouchardon did not act as a lawyer at her trial, but he was essentially a member of the prosecution team. This is the kind of thing that could happen during the war in cases of espionage that would normally be considered a conflict of interest in the French courts during peacetime. It's also notable that Bouchardon came into the proceedings already convinced of Mata Hari's guilt. He would later recall, quote, "From the first interview, I had the intuition that I was in the presence of a person in the pay of our enemies. From that time, I had but one thought, to unmask her," end quote. So Bouchardon was hardly a dispassionate investigator simply trying to get to the truth. Over the course of months, Mata Hari endured long interrogation sessions with Bouchardon while surviving in the famously dank Saint-Lazare prison. In this time, she made a handful of fairly incriminating confessions. While she never once admitted to working for the Germans, she did eventually tell Bouchardon that she had accepted money from the German consul in The Hague, money she believed was compensation for her seized valuables. This confession, paired with the testimony of the two French police officers who had tailed Mata Hari since her return to France in 1916, bank records which showed the receipt of funds from the Germans, the intercepted telegrams, and the testimony of our old friend Georges Ladoux, represented all the evidence that was introduced by the prosecution at trial. Her trial took place over the course of 2 days, beginning on July 24th, 1917. Now, to this day, the formal record of this trial remains restricted. But historians have been able to piece the trial together by using the official judgment, which was made part of the public record, a letter written about the trial by an observer, and 2 other eyewitness accounts from court officials. What many historians, including Pat Shipman, Mary Craig, and Rosie White, have pointed out is that a huge part of the case made by the prosecution at trial had to do with Mata Hari's sex life. The 2 French detectives who had been tailing Mata Hari and had kept meticulous records of her movements and communications could present no evidence that she was engaged in espionage. But they were questioned at length about Mata Hari's many male companions. They detailed her nightly liaisons with a long list of men, some of whom were foreigners. They made sure to underscore encounters that clearly seemed like obvious instances of sex work. These witnesses in no way helped establish that Mata Hari had been spying. In fact, the lack of evidence that she had been doing work for the Germans in Paris was notable. Their testimony was used entirely to establish that Mata Hari had done some sex work, And even when she wasn't taking money for sex, she was promiscuous in a way that her contemporaries found scandalous. This was used specifically as evidence of her character. Bouchardon's final report on Mata Hari, which formed the basis of the prosecution's case, characterized her like this, quote, "One can see that a woman such as Mata Hari, with her successive liaisons, could play a useful role in obtaining the half-secrets that fit together. Speaking several languages, having lovers in all the capitals of Europe spread across the world, they are finding discreet collaborations. She flatters herself that she is, in her own words, an international woman." End quote. That final line was particularly suggestive. The term international woman was sometimes used as a euphemism for a high-class sex worker or a scandalously promiscuous woman. The fact that Mata Hari called herself an international woman, well, that was seen as proof that she was immoral and proud of it. And if she was already an internationally immoral woman, then it only follows that she was obviously a spy. Or so goes the thinking. From there, the prosecution presented the testimony of Ladoux, who insisted that he had never made her a real French agent, and that he had always suspected Mata Hari of being a German spy. He claimed that everything he did was in service of catching her. The only physical evidence presented of her crimes were the intercepted telegrams that we spoke about earlier and her bank records. Now, Mata Hari was technically on trial for 8 specific charges that had been recommended by Bouchardon. I think it's worthwhile for us to go through those charges right now and ask, based on what was presented at trial, should she have been convicted? Just a note here, I have truncated these charges for the sake of brevity and clarity. Okay, let's get into them. Charge number 1. Mata Hari entered the war zone of Paris in December of 1915 in order to obtain documents or information in the interest of Germany and enemy power. Okay, the prosecution was able to show that she took money from the Germans and then came to Paris, but not that she gained any documents or information while there. Did she have the intention to do that? I'm not sure they showed evidence of that at trial. Now, you could argue that because she took the money, it would have looked like intention. So maybe you can find her guilty on that count. Maybe. Charge 2. In Holland, Mata Hari procured for Germany documents or information susceptible to damaging operations of the French army. I don't think the prosecution showed any evidence of this whatsoever. Charge 3. In Holland, Mata Hari maintained contact with Germany in order to facilitate the enterprise of the enemy. Once again, they were able to show that Mata Hari took money from the Germans in the Netherlands. So if you want to argue that that constitutes maintaining contact, I'll give you that one. Charge number 4. Mata Hari entered Paris again in July of 1916 in order to secure documents or information in the interests of Germany. This one is basically the same as the first charge. Again, all the prosecution showed is that she came to Paris after having accepted German money, but they didn't prove anything else. Charge number 5. While in Paris since May 1916, Mata Hari maintained contact with Germany with the aim of assisting enterprises of the enemy. Once again, I don't think the prosecution presented any evidence at trial that proved that she was in contact with the Germans while she was living in Paris. Charge number 6. In Madrid, Mata Hari maintained contact with Germany in the person of Captain Kala. Now, this one, I think there actually was some evidence. Mata Hari admitted that she had met with Kala, but she always maintained that she was spying on him for France. But remember, the prosecution had the telegrams, which were evidence that she had been working for him as a spy. So, given that evidence, I suppose you might convict on that count. Charge number 7. The defendant delivered to Germany documents susceptible to damaging the operations of the French army. Okay, so they had that one telegram that suggested that Mata Hari had passed on some very tame gossip. But beyond that, they had nothing else. And I think you'd have to squint pretty hard to see that information as potentially harmful to the French army. Finally, charge number 8. In Paris, in January 1917, Mata Hari maintained contact with Germany. Once again, they had no evidence of this. So, I think it's reasonable to argue that the prosecution did not make their case beyond a reasonable doubt. But that wasn't really the bar they needed to clear in the heated atmosphere of wartime France. But even if we adjust our standards and move to convict where there is at least some evidence, even then, I think that Mata Hari could only have been found guilty of 4 of the 8 charges leveled against her. Well, the 7 military judges trying the case in 1917 felt differently. They found Margarita Zella guilty on all counts and sentenced her to death by firing squad. From there, the character of Mata Hari would pass firmly into the realm of myth. So, what should we make of this? Was she a spy? Did she deserve her fate? Did someone frame Mata Hari? Well, this is one where I want to encourage you to engage with the sources and draw your own conclusions, because there is a lot of room for interpretation in this story. But if you're curious about my opinion, well, here's what I think. It seems to me like Mata Hari never fully understood herself to be a German spy. Personally, I believe her story that she thought that she could get away with taking money from the Germans without ever having to cross the boundary into becoming a spy. Now, I also think that she was deluding herself a bit. Once she took that money, the die was cast. If anyone ever found out about that transaction, she would appear like a German spy, whether or not she actually did any spying. She should have understood that. But I don't think she fully appreciated the gravity of that choice. I've been pulled towards this interpretation largely because of her later conduct in France. It doesn't seem like she did any spying while she was there, or at least there's very little evidence that she did any spying while she was living in Paris. She was also so brazen in her demand for the special pass to go to Vittel. I mean, she went into the office of the head of the French intelligence service and asked to go to a military zone. I think she was so confident because she honestly didn't think she could be caught for anything. She didn't think she was a German spy. Or at least that's how I read that interaction. You are free to disagree. With all that said, Mata Hari was clearly a bit of a mercenary. She put herself forward to spy for the French because she wanted the money. It was the same reason she nodded along when the Germans attempted to recruit her. Now, the biggest myth about Mata Hari was that she was some kind of seductive super spy. As much as she was taking meetings with both the German and French intelligence services, I see no evidence that she ever did much spying. She clearly gleaned a few things from Captain Kala about a submarine drop-off in Morocco, and a few other suggestive details, but there's no evidence that she ever passed anything of value to the Germans. I think that Mata Hari was played by both the French and the Germans. I think the Germans never planned for her to do anything but be an unwitting smokescreen for real German secret agents. I think they purposefully leaked information about the money that they transferred to Mata Hari to put her on the British and French intelligence radar. I think the Germans intentionally tipped the British that Clara Benedict's was on the steamer SS Hollandia, specifically so Mata Hari would get confused with that real agent. Then, I think the Germans purposefully sent those incriminating telegrams using a code that they knew was broken in order to sacrifice Mata Hari to the French. They cultivated Mata Hari specifically to throw the French some red spy meat right when it was strategically convenient. Now, I can't prove all of this, but based on everything I read, that's the story that makes the most sense to me. You can certainly disagree. Many do. This is just my personal take based on my reading and influenced by the likes of Mary Craig and Pat Shipman. Look at the sources for yourself. Hit me with your own theories if you think I'm off on this one. So, who framed Mata Hari? The Germans, but also the French, specifically Georges Ladoux. We know for a fact that when Ladoux first met Mata Hari, he suspected her of being a German spy. Both Mata Hari and Ladoux would admit to that fact. I think Ladoux played her right from the start. He gave Mata Hari a phony mission while keeping her under fairly strict surveillance. I believe he was either trying to use her to find more German spies, or, even more interestingly, he may have been using her as a smokescreen for his own traitorous activities. We got smokescreens on smokescreens on smokescreens here, kids. Remember, Georges Ladoux was eventually arrested for spying for the Germans. Now, he was ultimately exonerated of that crime, but questions still persist. Whether or not Ladoux was using Mata Hari to deflect attention from his own double-dealing, he most certainly used her. When it became clear that he was going to learn everything he could from her, he sent her to her doom. I truly believe that Mata Hari was used as a pawn. Now, this doesn't mean she was totally blameless in all of this. She thought she could operate in the dangerous world of international espionage. She chose to engage. But the life of an international spy was quite different from that of an international celebrity. Finally, Mata Hari's trial demonstrated just exactly how much danger she'd been in from the start. The French military court was able to convict her on the basis of very little physical evidence. A huge part of the prosecution's case was based on who she was, rather than what she had done. Historian Rosie White has written, quote, "Unwittingly, Margarita Zella MacLeod, aka Mata Hari, had come to represent the most feared and desired aspects of modernity in the person of the modern woman, and for this reason, she was executed." End quote. Now, I don't mean to step on Rosie White's rhetorical point here, but I think it's important to point out that Mata Hari's execution was also deeply tied to anxieties connected to the war and a certain spy mania that was sweeping France. Not to mention the fact that there was some real evidence that she was in league with the Germans. Nevertheless, Rosie White's point is well taken. The prosecution used Mata Hari's sexuality as a key piece of evidence against her. And the irony is they probably didn't need to. But Mata Hari too perfectly fit the stereotype of the evil seductress, and so the stereotype was employed. Margarita Zella MacLeod spent her life running away from tragedy. Her fraught adolescence, her abusive marriage, the loss of her children. So she created a new identity and a new life. She learned, with a little creativity and a little hustle, she could create a fantasy that others were happy to indulge. But the harmless fictions of a nearly nude dancer would prove to be quite different from the careful deceptions of a secret agent. In the end, Georges Ladoux was right about one thing. Mata Hari was a gambler. She played, and she lost. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. I hope you enjoyed this 3-parter on Mata Hari. In 2 weeks, we'll be looking at something completely different. Before we go this week, as always, I need to give a shout out to some very special people. Big ups to Jesus Sanchez, to Aaron Donnett, to Connor Runyon, to Nathan Coral, to Thomas Wade, to Blue LA. This next one is tricky. To, I think it's You can let me know. Big ups to Alex Kazaic Kaiwitz, to Christopher Cruson, to Lee Frazier, to Lewis Reynolds, to Ben, to Jim Huss, to Matt Ambrogi, to Pavel Komyasha, to Dead for Tax Purposes. I like that one. To Lyle and to Neil Tazzy Patterson. And because you pledged in Australian dollars, I'm guessing you are Tazzy Patterson because you're from Tasmania. We'll see. All of these people have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They're beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your ongoing support. Thank you to everyone who pledges at all levels. Thank you to the people who go to the TeePublic store and buy Our Fake History merch. If you want to get a t-shirt or something like that, just go to the website, ourfakehistory.com, and follow the links to the merch store. Thank you to everyone that writes nice 5-star reviews of the show. If you want to support the show and you're like, I can't afford to be a patron, I get it. Just go write a nice review and give us 5 stars. It makes a difference. Or just tell a friend about the show if you think they would dig it. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook. That's facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. And you can find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. I'm ourfakehistory everywhere you go. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major. And remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.